Venkatji, firstly, thank you for the very generous welcome and some reflection on how long we've known each other. The years do stack up, but I've always really valued this relationship with yourself, with Indian News Link and the community more broadly. We've had two announcements today which are not in immigration. One is that we are fully funding the Eastern Busway to deliver great public transport to East Auckland. And we've also started construction on Penlink, the critical road and public transport route to the Whangaproa Peninsula. So the announcements this weekend are more in the transport space, but I can confirm we have been looking closely at some immigration issues, and we are likely to have some announcements before Christmas. I won't be able to say in advance what they are, but do watch the space because we continue to work hard on those issues.
Thank you, Minister. As far as the Eastern Busway is concerned, I can say that personally, I'm extremely happy that this is happening because the Reeves Road flyover is just 300 meters from my house. And therefore, one of the beneficiaries of this project will be myself. And on that score, we've got a very, very, very good friend from the Northern Hemisphere, Alamelu from United States of America. I don't know what time it is there, Alamelu. Welcome. Right.
Thank you.
Minister.
It is 6 p.m.
Oh, all right. Okay.
Yes.
Welcome. Welcome. Minister, the first question that we have for you this afternoon, which is on the top of the mind of many people in the community.
Sorry to interrupt you 1 minute, Venkatji. I will only just keep you and Minister Michael Wood.
Yeah.
Rest of them, can we please go on mute if you're not already, so that we can have a seamless discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Vasu. Thank you. Minister, to repeat, this is a question on the top of the mind of many people in the community. When will the government allow migrant workers stranded in India and other places to return to New Zealand? Many of them are in severe distress.
Thank you for the question on that issue, which is one I have been asked before. A couple of comments on this issue. The first is that in the vast majority of cases, people do now have a visa pathway to be able to come into New Zealand. It is true that during the period of COVID lockdowns, we did have people who had valid visas that they were not able to use to come into New Zealand because of international border closures, both in New Zealand and in India. And of course, most countries experienced that. As of July of this year, New Zealand's borders have been fully opened. And so for the vast majority of people who are able to offer skills that are needed in the New Zealand labour market, there are clear visa pathways to be able to work in New Zealand. And I understand that often people would like us to go back and undo the past there. We're not always able to do that, but we are providing the visa pathways that enable people to come here. There is a very particular group of people who have raised the issue about their post-study work visas and their inability to access the work rights that they had from those after the border closure came down. And I consider that to be a more specific subgroup of this area, where it has been more challenging for those people to access the work rights that they would have had were it not for the border closures. That is a particular issue that I have been looking at closely. I have undertaken to provide certainty to that group of people before the end of this year, and I certainly will be providing that certainty. So again, it's one of those ones where I know people would love me to make an announcement today. I'm not quite in a position to be able to do that, but we will provide certainty very soon to that particular group.
Thank you, Minister. I'm sure people in India and other places who are stranded will be looking for some more clarity. And if you can please ask Immigration New Zealand officials to provide them some kind of guidance as to how they can come to New Zealand and perhaps try and regularize their stay thereafter. As we have been saying, they need an entry to come to this country. After that, it should be their responsibility to regularize their stay through a job process or a business enterprise or whatever. So our prayer to you today is to please make immigration officials aware of this so that they can provide clarity to those who seek the minister. On that score, may I congratulate you and your associate minister, our dear friend, Phil Tyford, for having given relief to that Hungarian family yesterday so that they could stay back in New Zealand, having invested money in a restaurant. Congratulations on that, Minister. I think you have earned a lot of goodwill on that score there, and I'm sure there will be many more to come. Minister, my next question.
Venkat, would it be okay if I just for a moment spoke briefly about that case, because I know that it's attracted a lot of public interest?
Yeah.
These are very interesting cases that we have to deal with, and they can be very challenging. The reality is that every year, tens of thousands of people achieve residency in New Zealand. In fact, this year it will be over 100,000 because of Residence Visa 2021. And most of them just go quietly through the system and don't see the light of day. But from time to time, we get a case like this. And I think people sometimes are interested in why cases get to that point. And the thing I'll just convey to people is that it's very, very important that if you want a fair immigration system with integrity, it has to be rules-based. You have to have objective rules in place, and people have to get treated equally beside them. You need to say, this is how you get a visa, this is how you get residency. If you meet that test, we'll give it to you. And if you don't, we won't. That is the only fair way to run an immigration system. Otherwise, you end up having a very subjective system and playing favourites to some people. That works in probably about 95% of cases, and they go through the system. You then get cases like this one where the people did not meet the rules. They came in with one particular proposal. This is all publicly reported on, did not set up a business on that basis and were not compliant with the rules that would have given them a pathway to residency. And that always seems unfortunate, particularly when it's, in this case, a lovely couple with a lovely family who the community valued. But you can't run an immigration system where within the core processing you say, we like these people, so we're going to treat them differently to everyone else. So what we do at the back end of the system is we say, okay, you run through that rules-based system. If that doesn't work and you're not successful, you ultimately do have rights of appeal. And in particular, in appealing through to the Associate Minister, there can be more discretion which is exercised. And that is exactly what's happened in this case. So I would just say to people that rather than, some people have suggested this case is one of a failing of the system, I would say that this is a case where the system has actually shown that it works. There's been a fair, objective and rules-based assessment. The people haven't reached that. They've then exercised their rights to go to the minister. And I think a good, equitable outcome has been reached.
Yeah. Yes, Minister, we do realize that immigration is a very emotional issue and it can often go beyond certain borders. And we do realize that there are protocols to be followed. This is what we always keep telling our listeners and our members of this group, as well as readers of Indian Newslink, is that there could be exception to cases, but they have to fall into norms. They have to fall into certain criteria. Minister, my next question is, what are the measures being implemented to facilitate the issue of work visas in the sectors facing severe staff shortage? Will the government waive the minimum medium wage so that businesses that are suffering can recover?
Well, thank you, Venkat. And this is an issue that we are very aware of, that we do have a number of sectors where there are real pressures in terms of getting access to enough workers in that area. A few very important things to note on this count. The first is that New Zealand is not alone. You can open up the media or watch the television, and pretty much all of the developed countries of the world, including our nearest neighbour, Australia, and exactly these same pressures are being experienced in those labour markets as well. It's a combination of a number of factors. We have record low unemployment at the moment, so workers have very easy access to work. Workers have more power in the labour market and are able to shift into occupations that might offer better pay or more secure terms and conditions. And that's been experienced in every country around the world, all of the developed countries anyway. At the same time, borders were closed and only opened over the last 6 months in many countries around the world. People still don't quite have the confidence to travel around the world that they did before the pandemic. And so the whole international labour market is just a bit, not quite frozen, but is a bit more frigid and sticky than it has been in the past. So that creates these real challenges. So that's not to make excuses, but that's just to put the context there. What people want to know is, what are we doing? Well, firstly, we got the main temporary work visa settings open from July, as soon as we opened our borders. That's the accredited employer work visa. And I think the key thing to note here is that the government has now issued over 85,000 job checks in the AEWV. The job check is the bit of the system where the government says, yes, employer, we're going to tick you off, we give you permission, go out and recruit in the international labour market. Those take only on average 4 days to process. So that part of the system has been working very smoothly, and we've given a lot of capacity for employers to be able to go out and recruit. We're now seeing employers beginning to get into the labour market and actually then identify the workers and bring them here. That does take a bit of time because the employers have got to go, they've got to find people, interview them, confirm them. That workers then got to, as many of our listeners today will know, it takes a while to change up your life and get ready to move to a new country. We've now had about nearly 30,000 work visas have been applied for under the system, and close on 15,000 of those people have been approved. So we're beginning to see people move through that system. Then in other categories, we've done things like increase the number of working holiday visas who are able to come to New Zealand. For all of the capped working holiday schemes, we doubled the numbers for this year. We recognise there's a particular need to try and address some of these shortages. So we said to all of those countries, you can bring double the numbers of people to New Zealand over the coming year. We also extended the period out that people have to arrive here who had a valid working holiday visa, and we gave more time for the people who are already on shore to stay and work in New Zealand as well. We're also going to start to see more students coming into the country, and they're often able to assist via their work rights with some of the work, particularly in hospitality and tourism, for example. So we have quite a significant number of areas where we've got a lot of work that's going on. We're beginning to get good volumes of people coming into the country. We've now got over 20,000 working holiday makers who have arrived in the country, and they're arriving in the country at about the rate of 14 to 1,500 per week. So it is still definitely tough out there in some sectors, but I think we're starting to see some green shoots. Now, you asked the question about relaxing the median wage requirement. We won't be doing that for the core accredited employer work visa scheme, and that's because we have a very deliberate policy that we need to shift away, in our view, from the old model of the immigration system, focusing very heavily on a lot of low wage labour. And I'll be very honest with people, that was a recipe for large scale exploitation in New Zealand, and we're not going to put up with that anymore. So the accredited employer work visa scheme does have that median wage requirement in there, but we do have some flexibility that's built into it. So for certain sectors, including sectors like hospitality, we've got transition agreements in place whereby they are able for many roles to bring people in on a rate that's a little lower than the median wage, because we recognise it's going to take some time to sustainably get up to that level. The same for people on working holiday visas. They're not required to be paid at the median wage rate either. So we have built some of that flexibility in the system to help some of those sectors where we know that it is particularly challenging.
Oh, thank you, Minister. That's quite an extensive explanation. Before I go into the next question, which is somewhat related to what you just answered, on the question of exploitation, do you know whether the number of cases of exploitation has been going up in recent years, or is it coming down? Do you have any idea?
It's a little hard to tell, and I'll just explain why that is. The very first thing to say is that we clearly have experienced a very real problem with exploitation across the labour market, and particularly relating to temporary migrant labour. And people can look at the published cases that come through the Employment Relations Authority to see what are, quite frankly, some horrifying cases of migrant workers being taken advantage of and exploited in ways that would make us feel ashamed of our country. I'll be very direct with you about that. We should never treat people who come to our country and work here like that. And it's been going on for a long time. And for a long time, to be quite honest, there's been a bit of a blind eye turned, previously by the government, but I also have to say by some parts of our community. And so one of my main tasks as minister, and one of my main goals, is to lift the covers, shine the light, show some leadership, and make sure we have the measures in place to stop this from happening. Some of that is through our core immigration settings. Some of it is through measures such as creating the migrant exploitation visa. Some of it is the legislation that Priyanka Radhakrishnan is taking through the House now that will crack down on employers who use the immigration system to carry out these practices. So we have a lot of work underway in this process. The reason I say it's hard to tell whether we've had an increased or a decreased number is I think in the past, a lot of this has gone on and not been properly reported. People have felt scared to come forward because they've been worried that they would lose their visas. Now that we have the migrant exploitation visa in place, which came in from the 1st of July last year, we now have more people beginning to come forward, and we have had hundreds of cases of people coming through the 0800 number, which we've set up, reporting cases and getting onto that visa. So we'll start to get more data around this. I just want to note one thing that's really important here. There's work for the government to do here, but we need the community to come forward. And I'll give a positive example here. Dinesh Khadkar is well known as one of our key community leaders in the Nepalese community.
Yeah.
He's recently supported a migrant worker who has been experiencing migrant exploitation to get access to support services and to try and make sure that there is some justice. That's the kind of community leadership we need, our senior leaders coming forward and saying to other leaders in the business community, we can't tolerate this anymore. This is not who we are, and we're going to put a stop to it.
Oh yeah, okay. Thanks, Minister. We'll come back to that in a little while. Now, as a part of addressing skill shortages, will the government allow qualified people in certain identified professions, such as IT, engineering, pharmacy, and perhaps even chefs in the hospitality sector, to come to New Zealand on job search visas?
We don't have that setting in place at the moment. And at the moment, I'm not convinced that there is necessarily a gap that requires that. We know that in many of these key areas, we do have genuine labour shortages. And we know that actually these days, it's relatively simple through online mechanisms for employers in New Zealand and potentially employees offshore to connect up to one another and for a recruitment process to be undertaken. In the past, that kind of visa activity was sort of there because you sort of needed to be able to meet in person in order to be able to make a job offer and recruit someone. And there are other mechanisms for doing that now. What I would say is that across a number of those areas, we've also tried to make things a little bit easier. We've made, for example, changes to the definitions of how we accept chefs under the accredited employer work visa over recent months after we received feedback. And some of those roles that you mentioned, some of those higher skilled roles, for example, in medicine, many of those roles either have a very clear pathway through the skilled migrant category or through the green list way, in which case we can put very, very attractive offers out in the international market to workers directly to say, you could come to New Zealand and either immediately or within a couple of years become a resident of this country, which is a highly desirable offer. So I think we do have the tools in the toolkit. My mind's not closed about whether there are more things we can do, but at this stage, given the labour shortages, I think it's probably just easier and simpler for employers to directly recruit from offshore.
We asked you that question because, Minister, many people have represented to you at community events and perhaps even through letters and emails. If you were to look at it and then come back maybe in the next few weeks as to what the decision would be in favor of allowing people with qualifications to come in, it would be great. Minister, another question which has been asked by no less than 100 people for this program is, can you please explain the parent and grandparent categories of visas and how the applications that were stopped many years ago will be processed? The reason for this question is that there is a fair amount of confusion in the minds of people of the closure date and the restart date. So if you can please clarify, a lot of people will be at ease.
Thank you, and very happy to speak to this issue. As well as being, of course, the Minister of Immigration, I'm the MP for Mount Roskill. And in that role, I've got the pleasure of having a really strong relationship with many of our migrant communities because our community is one of the most diverse in New Zealand. And when I came into the role of Minister of Immigration, I said to my officials on day one that one of the things that we had to do as soon as we reasonably could was to reopen the parent category. And that's because I've received so much feedback over the years about the importance of that category for many of our migrant communities. It was closed under the previous national government in 2016. We were set to reopen it in early 2020, and then of course the borders closed. So I accelerated work on that, and I'm really pleased that we're able to announce a policy in October, and as of November, it's getting underway again. So I would firstly just say to people, there's really good information up on the Immigration New Zealand website in terms of some of the very specific details. If you want to check those out, do have a look on the Immigration New Zealand website. But broadly speaking, we're doing two things with the reopening of the parent category. First, we're dealing with the existing list of people who already had expressions of interest in place when the category closed back in 2016, and people who added expressions of interest at a later point than that. There's around about 8,000 to 9,000 of those that built up in the system and have been sitting there over that period. So our first priority, out of a sense of fairness, is to try and assist those people and get that system moving. So the way that we're doing that is that we've reopened the category, and we will be reopening it to 2,000 places per year for people who have an existing expression of interest in the system. There'll be probably 4 draws per year, where on average we'll pull out about 500 from that existing pool and process those applications for people. And what we have said to people on that list is that because when we announced this, we've actually made it a bit more simple and flexible. We've lowered the income thresholds from what they were previously, and we've given greater flexibility by allowing siblings to join their income to meet the thresholds as well. Previously, it was only a main sponsor and their partner. Now it can be a main sponsor and a sibling, and the overall levels income levels have dropped. So we enable people to, if they pulled out their applications previously, to put them back in on that level. We had the first draw a few weeks ago. So we've got just over 500 which have been drawn, and we're going to start working on those now. So that's going to provide a pathway for those people. So about 2,000 of those will be worked through every year from the existing list. Then what we've said is we recognise that there are a lot of people in New Zealand who didn't previously have EOIs in and would really like to enter this process. And so we will start an annual ballot of 500 places per year for new EOIs. And that first draw will take place from August of next year. So people have up until that point to put new EOIs in there. And those new EOIs will stay in the system for 2 years and will be able to be pulled out via the ballot in that process. And that will be a randomised ballot, which we do think is, for that process, is the fairest way of doing it. So that, broadly speaking, Venkat, is how we'll take it forward. An initial focus on 2,000 per year from the existing list, and an additional 500 per year for new EOIs. And that will provide pathways for more people to reconnect with their parents.
Minister, when you say a sibling will be allowed, is this the old system of an adult, non-resident adult child allowed along with the parents and grandparents to come into New Zealand?
Oh, just to clarify that, I meant on the other side. This is in terms of sponsors in New Zealand reaching the income threshold to bring their parent to New Zealand. Yeah. 2 siblings in New Zealand who are resident will be able to join their incomes together to reach that threshold.
And have you revised the minimum or maximum income threshold to facilitate more people?
Yes, we have, Venkat. Previously, the threshold was based on twice the median wage for the first parent, and we have lowered that to 1.5 times the median wage. And the threshold for additional parents, and I say all of the details are up on the Immigration New Zealand website. It was, generally speaking, an additional median wage on top of that. We've lowered that to an additional 0.5 times the median wage. So we have lowered those thresholds significantly. We do still believe that that income threshold is an important way of making sure that people have the means to be able to look after their parent adequately when they come here, which has been a concern at times in the past when there wasn't any such threshold. But we've lowered it to a level that we think will be more accessible for people. And as I say, by enabling that flexibility for siblings to join their incomes together as well as parents, that will just open it up to more people as well.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, there is a perception, I don't know, I don't have figures to prove otherwise or for or otherwise. There's this popular perception that many medical professionals are moving to other countries such as Australia and Canada, where they can have ease of movement for their families. Why has New Zealand not facilitated the same for valued professionals? How else can we bridge the widening gap between demand and supply?
I think some of this is perception, frankly. As I said at the beginning, you can read about these shortages in some of these professions in all of the countries that you've just talked about. In Canada, in Australia, all around the world, there is a real shortage in some of these areas. It's for the reasons I talked about before. And frankly, it's been because developed countries have not done a very good job of their internal training pathways for a long time as well. And that's something that we're doing a lot of work on as well. In respect of most of those highly skilled roles in medicine, for example, we have pretty facilitative settings for people. Partners can come here and, generally speaking, have open work rights. For most of those highly skilled roles, they will have a very clear and simple residency pathway, either through the green list or through the skilled migrant category. We mustn't lose sight of that. For most people around the world, the prospect of being able to come to this beautiful, peaceful paradise at the bottom of the South Pacific is a very, very attractive offer. So I think that having that residency pathway is really critical for many of those roles. And that's why we've tried to provide that through the green list and SMC. And generally speaking, with some process, of course, people will be able to bring partners and families with them as they look to settle in New Zealand and contribute their skills here. So I'm broadly convinced that we have good facilitative settings in that space. We always look at what more we can do, of course, but I would say that some of those comments that we hear in that area are more about perception. One of the areas where some of those countries do have a slight advantage can be on wages. So some of those countries do just pay slightly higher wages for some of those highly skilled roles. As a government, we're investing more in our public services to make sure that we try and pay some of those people competitively. But with some of those roles, we probably there will still be a bit of a wage gap, and that's where New Zealand needs to press and market itself for some of the other benefits we have here in terms of the benefits of living in New Zealand, the lifestyle that we have here, the peaceful communities that we have here to attract people that we need.
Yeah, we do understand, Minister, that the private sector also has to play a part in this by lifting the wages so that they can make the market more attractive, like some of the other countries that have been mentioned in my question. Minister, moving to the field of international education or export education sector, as it is said, we had a conversation with a Labour member of, he's not a member of parliament, a very senior member of the Labour Party, who is involved in the education sector. You would know who he is when I ask you this question. He says that New Zealand has failed to attract students from India. The number of students from India is getting dropped. It used to have the second largest share in the export education sector. Minister, as you answer this question, can you also tell us, if you have the figures, as to how many Indian students have come in since the borders opened, and what was the situation during pre-COVID time?
Well, thank you, Venkat. The international education sector is a really important one for New Zealand. It is one of those ones, again, where we have been doing some work to make sure that we provide a quality experience and that we shift away a little bit from what has in the past at times been a bit of a low quality model, which sometimes hasn't been good for New Zealand's reputation or the experiences of those students. So there have been some changes in settings that we think we needed to make there. And of course, COVID was devastating for the sector. By definition, when borders were closed, it was extremely difficult for the sector. So I do acknowledge some of those challenges. And again, they've been felt all around the country. But we are now in a rebuilding phase. We have around over 20,000 now people who have got valid international student visas. And those are people who are both inside and outside of New Zealand. Around about 17 to 18,000 of them in total are in New Zealand. So we've seen those numbers building up over recent months. And it is my expectation that as we move into 2023, and we're getting a lot of applications coming through now, and that will continue through December, that we will actually see quite a strong recovery in overall numbers as we head into 2023. The Indian market is going to continue to be a very, very important part of the international education sector. And across some of the key areas, I think it's probably going to continue to be one of the top markets. I have some indicative numbers here, which are just over the last few months. So, for example, in the PTE sector, students from India are in fact the largest number of people who have put applications in that are being considered for their visa status. For Te Pukenga, that is our new national polytechnic system. Again, Indian students have put in the highest number of applications and have the highest number of approvals to come and study in New Zealand as well. In the case of the university sector, and this is historic, China has been the biggest market there as well. So while our numbers will still be affected for some time, and it will take some time to rebuild from COVID, and in fact, we are targeting a little bit more on the quality side and a little less on the quantity side these days, I expect those numbers to build up strongly in general terms, but also from India in particular.
Minister, do you accept the accusation that Education New Zealand has been somewhat lackluster in exposure, market exposure towards India? Because in the past years, during the Labour government, there used to be a number of trade shows and road shows conducted in conjunction with Immigration New Zealand and Education New Zealand. That doesn't seem to have happened in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years. Are you trying to revive that kind of market exposure?
Some of that area is a little more in the area of responsibility of education rather than myself. But what I would say in general terms is that we really want to, post-COVID, rebuild a vibrant international education market. It's important economically for New Zealand, but actually I think the other thing that's just as important, it builds our connections with the world. And some of those people who study here will, of course, exercise post-study work rights, will work in New Zealand and contribute here in the years ahead. Many of them will return home. But in years ahead, they will know something of New Zealand. They will have connections here. They will think favourably of this place. And I think that's a huge investment in our future. So it's really important. I'll certainly be keen to work with my colleagues to look at how we can really start to rebuild some of these markets. I would also say that it is, of course, primarily the job of the sector itself to be promoting itself, to be talking about what it can offer, and to be attracting people here. But certainly through Immigration New Zealand, which I'm responsible for, we'll be very open to looking at what we can reasonably do to support that. And I would really emphasise that, in recent months, I know that Immigration New Zealand have been working very closely with the international education sector as we begin to open up and as we work on how we do bring people back into the sector. Their initial focus has just been on getting the processing system going really well again, but no doubt there is more that we can do as we rebuild those markets.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, at the risk of repetition, may I ask you, can international students expect to qualify for permanent residence on completion of their graduation or post-graduation? What are the plans of your government?
Thank you, Venkat. The answer in general, as a matter of course, is no, that is not an automatic. The way that we structure our international education system is that it is focused on people coming here to get an education. I think one of the problems that we've had in this area in the past is that there have been mixed messages, and we have quite often had people coming here to study who have had an expectation, sometimes encouraged by unscrupulous agents who just want the cash, that it will lead to a residency pathway, when actually the settings haven't always supported that. And then you have a lot of people who feel disappointed, when really international education is primarily about coming to New Zealand and getting an education. We do, of course, have the post-study work rights system, and that is a way of just providing some additional support to those people to be able to then work for some time after their studies. We've had some reforms to that, but it will still provide pathways for a lot of those students to work in New Zealand during that period. It's generally linked to the period of time that they studied, particularly level 7 and above. And when people are engaged in that, they'll then have the opportunity to look at whether they want to exercise other work rights, including work rights which might lead to a residency pathway. So if you've come here, you've studied, in a let's say a highly skilled area of medicine or construction to a suitable level, you'll be able to pick up your post-study work rights, work here for maybe, I don't know, two or 3 years. And in that time, particularly if your area of work is in demand, there'll be very good opportunities for you either through the Accredited Employer Work Visa Scheme or through the Green List or through Skilled Migrant category to look at some of those pathways.
Would you say then, Minister, that INZ may, I emphasize the word may, invariably consider a work visa application of a graduate or a postgraduate?
Well, yes, they may. Yes, that's right. So certainly people have that ability to apply for those visa types after their studies. And as we've canvassed over the course of this discussion, in many of these areas, we know that there are real shortages. We know that we're going to have people who have some of these skills who come through in that way. So I think there are real opportunities there. That the thing I just want to be clear about is that coming to New Zealand to study does not provide an automatic pathway to residency. We don't want to create that false impression and then have people feeling let down. We want to be clear that the primary focus is education, but there can be pathways after that.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Has Immigration New Zealand opened its offices, which were closed during COVID and immediately prior to that, especially in India and other major centers? Now, how long does it take for a person to get a visitor visa approved? Can people expect faster processing of visas?
We haven't reopened those big offshore processing centres that we had before COVID. All of that capacity during COVID was brought back onshore. So for obvious reasons, we needed to do that during that period. And we now have more overall capacity, slightly more people as immigration officers who are processing across those visa types, based here and deployed across a range of service centres in New Zealand. And at this point in time, we plan to keep it that way. I think it would be quite disruptive and take a lot of time and energy and resource to go back and establish big new overseas centres. Whereas really what we just need to focus on now is getting the existing processing system going well. And we can best do that when we have direct oversight and control through onshore-based centres. You ask a very good question around visitor visas. Now, broadly speaking, the processing performance across Immigration New Zealand, I would describe, since we reopened in July, it has been mixed. So remember, we only properly reopened as of July. And certainly in the first few months across most categories, it was slower than we would have wanted. That was understandable to a degree as very big volumes came in, new systems were being set up, new immigration officers were dealing with them. Now, many of those areas, it really has speeded up very well. So for employer accreditation, for job check, for example, those are going through very well. Student visas are going through at a very good pace that I'm satisfied with. The two areas where I have conveyed to Immigration New Zealand that we need to improve performance on are work visa processing and visitor visa processing. For visitor visa processing from non-visa waiver countries, it varies depending on the complexity of the application, and it will vary as well depending on whether people provide all the information up front or whether people have to provide additional health information and that kind of thing. The processing speed is slowly improving, and we have now got the queue, the backlog of unprocessed applications has come down over the last month or so from around about 36,000 to around about 31,000. So steady progress is being made in working through that backlog, and in particular working through the backlog of cases that go back some months. And I've given a very clear message to Immigration New Zealand that those older cases need to be prioritised in order for people to have as much certainty as possible. So I would say that visitor visas is one of the areas, because of the very high volumes that came in after we reopened. We have got a bit of a backlog, has been a little slower than I want, but we're now making progress, and I'm confident that as we move into 2023, we'll have a more efficient system there. The final thing I'll just say on processing times, one of the factors has also been that at the same time as we've reopened all of these visa categories, AEWV, skilled migrant category, parent category, RSC, working holiday, all of them have been opened at about the same time. We've also then had RV21 in the background, the biggest ever residency program in New Zealand's history. We've given out over 120,000 residency approvals now. This government has approved more residency approvals this year than any government previously has, and there's about 95,000 still to go there. So we're stretching our officials and pushing them really hard to get those through, and we just have to balance that within the system across all of the different needs that we have.
So, Minister, 95,000 visa applications are still pending as far as the pathway to 21, that one-off is concerned. Is Immigration New Zealand also suffering from skill shortages?
Immigration New Zealand, like every other area, has to compete in a very, very tight labour market. They are, as we speak, fully staffed, and in fact, we are continuing to increase the number of processing staff to meet the demand that we have. We are able to do that, so we're not short of the people that we want at the moment, and we are increasing that number. But of course, with a job like this, when you bring people in, and it takes some time to initially train them and get them set up as immigration officers to process cases. In the first few months that people are in that role, they are still building their level of skill and their level of productivity. So you would not expect that someone who's been there as an immigration officer for a couple of months will be processing applications at the same pace as someone who's been there for a couple of years. And remember, we've only really been rebuilding the system since July of this year. So certainly in those first few months, the processing was a little slower. We are now in key categories, whether it's visitor visa, whether it's work visa, seeing the number of applications per day per immigration officer has been beginning to pick up over the last couple of months. So we're getting there with the numbers, and we're getting there with the efficiency of the process. That's supported by IT investment as well, but there is still some progress that we need to make there.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, what are the incentives that are being provided for foreign investors? Will they be granted permanent residence on fast-track basis?
Well, we've made changes to the investor rules in recent times, with the investor plus visa category being confirmed as of September of this year. And that does provide the ability for people to move towards residency on the basis of putting investments into New Zealand that improve our economy. We did make some changes to this area. And if I could broadly characterise that, we previously had a system where people were able to bring a relatively large amount of capital and invest it in very passive ways in New Zealand, maybe in property or shares or something like that, that didn't really necessarily generate the kind of economic benefits and jobs for New Zealand that we were really looking for. So with the new Investor Plus category, we've put more emphasis and more incentives for those investors to invest in areas like new startups or businesses that will generate economic activity and jobs. And if people do that, they'll effectively get more points within that system to support their application. So that system is now live. We're beginning to get applications coming in. It's just over the last couple of months that we've been confirming some of the rules around the appropriate types of investment. And I know people have been waiting for that, but that is largely in place now. And I expect that we'll see good quality applications beginning to flow through there over the coming months.
Thank you, Minister. That more or less concludes the issues on immigration. I've got a couple of other questions on equally important portfolios that you have, Minister. Although some of it might envelope areas of labour, Minister, as Workplace Relations and Safety Minister, what is your take on the increasing number of bullying and exploitation that goes on in the private sector, and perhaps to some extent in the public sector as well? Are you taking any measures to combat those?
Yes, Venkat, we are. It's a very important area, one that's very dear to my heart. People spend a lot of their time in the workplace. A lot of their waking hours are spent at work. And what happens at work affects people's physical and mental health. And everyone who goes to work deserves to come home safe. They deserve to come home unharmed. They deserve to come home with their well-being intact. And if people are experiencing things like bullying, harassment, unreasonable levels of stress that affect their psychosocial health, then we need to address that. We do know that we have had rates of bullying in our workplaces and harassment and other psychosocial harms that are far too high. It affects the individual, but actually ultimately in the long term, it affects the productivity of the business and of our economy as well, because if people aren't healthy in the workplace, they're not going to be fully productive. They'll be needing time away. Disputes will arise. It's actually not good for anyone. So it's important to deal with the issue. A few key things that we've been doing there. First, in budget 2019, we invested an additional $50 million into WorkSafe to make sure that they as the main regulator, build up their internal capacity to be able to deal with issues around bullying, harassment, and psychosocial harm. They have been doing that now. So they now have a direct pathway where people are able, if they have complaints and issues, to raise them through to WorkSafe to get support to resolve those. And they now have skilled professionals in the organisation. But really, just as importantly, they're now able to provide more guidance by way of good written information, people who can talk to employers, workshops and modules that they can run to support employers to deal with these issues before they become a big problem. The government is also looking, as we move into 2023, to more policy work in this area of bullying. We don't have a legal definition in the law at the moment as to exactly how we define bullying. There are questions as to whether that could be beneficial and whether we need to look at what the appropriate mitigations and penalties should be. So there'll be more policy work that's done there. I'd just say to folks who are listening out there, most employers are really good employers doing their best in providing positive environments. But if and when these problems arise, it's just best to deal with them as quickly as you can and as positively as you can. Don't be defensive about the issue. Get around the table, hear what people have got to say, and deal with it. The Health and Safety at Work Act says that when any harm arises in a workplace, whether it's physical harm or mental harm, there is a responsibility on the business or the organisation to respond to it and to eliminate it or to minimise it as much as possible. So it's a very important issue for us to take seriously. And you're right, Venkat, it's an issue in both the private and the public sector. So there's work for all of us to do.
Minister, there is a request that has just come in as a message to me that when you consider a policy initiative in areas of bullying, and while you define, the request is that please keep in perspective the positions of employers as well, because they shouldn't be victimized just because someone wants to complain against an employer. They say there must be proper parameters in place so that the employer's interests are also equally protected.
Yes, thank you. And that's a very fair comment to make. I think the key thing here is good, fair process, and that helps to protect everyone. And one of the things I often hear from employers, probably particularly smaller employers, is that if an issue or a complaint does arise in their workplace about something like this, they get a bit scared and they freeze up because sometimes they're just not sure about what the right process to go through is, and they're worried that they're going to get all the blame or there's going to be a penalty that gets put on them. And I guess that's why I emphasise within your business, do think proactively and have a policy, firstly about how you treat everyone with respect and you make sure that these issues don't arise and that your employees have a voice to raise issues before they get to a higher level. But secondly, that if someone does come forward and say, hey, I'm concerned that I've been getting bullied and this is what it means for me, to have a good process in place to deal with that. And there is lots of support that can be provided there. If you're a member of a Chamber of Commerce or Business New Zealand or a group like that, they'll be able to provide good support and advice around setting up good policies. You can pick up the phone and you can talk to Employment New Zealand. They've got a really, really good information line that you as an employer or an employee can run to get some advice about how to deal with these issues. You can go to the Employment New Zealand website, heaps of resources there. So the key, I think, here to protect yourself and to protect everyone's rights, have that good process in place. If a complaint comes forward, take it seriously, do look at it properly, look at the dispute resolution systems, and if they're worked through well, that can often be a good way of dealing with these issues and protecting everyone's interests.
Thank you, Minister. That's great help. Minister, in terms of your role as the Transport Minister in charge of infrastructure, what are the changes that are being brought about in the light of public reaction to some of your projects, and how will move projects like the City Rail and other areas of work move before the election in 2023?
Well, Venkat, we're working very, very hard to provide the infrastructure that our growing cities and our regions need. We have a few big policy problems that we're trying to solve here. The first is that, quite honestly, over the last 50 years, there has been a massive underinvestment in much of our transport infrastructure. And that goes across multiple governments. So I'm not pointing particular fingers there, but as a country, particularly in some of our biggest cities, which have really grown, we just haven't invested as we should have. If you look at something like public transport in Auckland, it was back in the 1970s. We had a guy called Mayor Robbie. He's the guy, if you go to Aotea Square, there's a statue of a little guy there shaking his fist. That's Mayor Robbie in the 70s. And he had the plan to build a proper linked up rail system for Auckland. He was stopped by the government of the day, the Muldoon government. If he had have done that, our city would have been transformed. We wouldn't have the congestion that we have. We wouldn't be so car dependent. We wouldn't be emitting so many greenhouse gases. But it was stopped because of a lack of vision at that time. So we're really determined to make up for that historical underinvestment, but also to future-proof and plan for the growth that we know is going to happen over the next 30 years or so. So that is why we are moving forward with really ambitious investments. As I said, just this weekend, we've confirmed the Eastern Busway, the new Penlink project for Whangaparoa, Auckland Light Rail. We're moving ahead with the alternative Waitemata Harbour Crossing. Now, some of these projects will take some years. We've got to start now, or the problems will get worse. And I'll also say this, I consider one of my biggest moral responsibilities as Transport Minister is the task to lower our carbon emissions. We're experiencing climate change now. We don't take action, our kids and our grandkids will inherit a world that is worse to live in, less stable to live in, and we shouldn't be doing that. And transport is one of the biggest contributors. So we know if we give people more options to take public transport, to walk or cycle in their communities, we can lower those emissions. Overall, you'll always get different responses to big projects. Some people will like them, some won't. You've got to listen to that feedback, but you've also got to show leadership. And overwhelmingly, what people say to me is when it comes to these bigger investments up and down the country, they just really want us to get on with it. They want to know we've thought carefully about it, but they want some leadership. They want to see these things built so that we deal with the growth in the future and have less congestion, less emissions, and more resilient and safer towns and cities.
Yeah, thank you, Minister. I know that some of these areas you've got to battle with issues like RMA and all kinds of issues. And I wish you well because you have been entrusted with some of the most onerous responsibilities, and we wish you well. With all that, Minister, Christmas approaching, when will Michael Wood, the Minister, become Michael Wood, the husband and a parent?
Very soon, Venkat. I'll be working up till a few days before Christmas, and in fact, I'm then the duty minister. So when we get into that Christmas holiday period, there has to be someone who's on call at all times, in case the minister is required to step forward and deal with issues. So I'm the duty minister on the 23rd, 24th, 25th, so on Christmas Day. So I'll be on the job if I'm required at that time. But after that, I will be taking a good holiday with my family. In our jobs, the truth is that through most of the year, we do have to make a very big sacrifice with our families. We generally can't take meaningful holidays through the year. But I make sure that in that period after Christmas and for a good chunk of January, I really do try and prioritise time with family and also time to relax and recharge so that I'm ready to do the best job possible from the start of the year. So I'll be looking forward to time here in Auckland with family and then heading off for a nice family holiday at the beach in January.
Excellent. Minister, I hope I could see you sometime in Pakuranga as well when you come to visit your grandparents. And on behalf of all of us, we are deeply indebted to you. You've always been a very ready minister. You have always obliged us with your presence at our events and whenever we wanted you to come on to this kind of discussions. On behalf of everyone here and the readers of Indian Newslink and members of the Indians Living in Auckland group, which is the biggest Facebook group in Auckland, I wish you well. I wish you, your family, everyone in the government, everyone in the Labour Party, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. God bless you.
God bless you. Merry Christmas, everyone. I hope everyone here has a wonderful Christmas and a very happy and prosperous New Year as well.